Heads up, this one gets a little heavier than usual. There might be some stuff in here that you don't really want to see or hear, so take a quick look at the screen just to be sure. Thanks. There's a famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe, you may have run across it once or twice, about a pair of childhood lovers. In the poem, the narrator describes their love as transcendent in its purity, so beautiful that even the angels in heaven envied them. Perhaps for that very reason, a cold wind comes in the night, chilling and killing the girl, and leaving her lover to pine forever after. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Annabel Lee is a beautiful poem. It's also not at all unusual. If you know anything about Poe, you know that this was like a thing for him. The Raven, Morella, Ligeia. In his own words, the death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, and equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such a topic are those of a bereaved lover. It sounds a little cheesy when you put it that way, but this is everywhere. Poe is hardly the only one to express this sentiment. Throughout history, over and over, art has paid tribute to the beauty of suffering. There are countless operatic pieces that center on this, like La Traviata and Madame Butterfly. The painting Ophelia by John Everett Milius is almost like a mascot for this theme. Film students have been watching Norman Bates stab Marion Crane to death in the shower for decades now. It endures even now in our postmodernist, hyper-self-aware world. The virgin suicides, the aesthetic vibe cultures of Instagram and Tumblr. The more tormented a celebrity, the more fantastical they seem to become to their admirers. It seems there's some sort of cultural connection between beauty and victimhood that's easy to just take for granted. It's so ubiquitous, I barely even noticed until now, which I do find a little disturbing. I mean, if victimhood is a bad thing, why do humans tend to make it look so beautiful? Before we get started, I just want to shout out Mila Goldberg's Creative Writing Bootcamp on Skillshare. It's full of great information about constructing realistic characters, which definitely feels relevant to what we're about to talk about. Click the link down in the description to take the course for free. A big thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. More on that later. Long before there were soap operas, there were melodramas. They were a staple back in Victorian England. These plays were full of recurring devices and archetypes and tropes that made them almost pleasantly formulaic. In a way, the surviving scripts act as a sort of time capsule for the stories people wanted to see back then, the values that they found important. In her University of Victoria article, Seduced and Dying, Deborah Deacon paints a picture of the key narrative in a lot of these plays, that of the fallen woman. Usually the story is pretty simple. An innocent, doe-eyed country girl would be seduced by a wealthy, mustache-twirling villain, often by falling for a false marriage proposal. Upon discovering what had happened, the maiden would instantly be overcome with shame and nearly end her life, just to escape her own guilt. Once she'd sobbed enough, fainted enough, and thrown herself into the river enough, she could finally be forgiven for her transgressions. I won't say that these plays had happy endings, but I think that's how the Victorian audience would have thought of it. Happy. In John J. Stafford's Love's Frailties, for instance, Susan is seduced by the dastardly Squire Belgrade. Once he sees how much she's suffered, he apologizes and marries her for real. That's it. As consolation for all her suffering, she gets to spend the rest of her life with her abuser. Happily ever after. Occasionally, these melodramas did end on a darker note, even by the audience's standards. In Alex Lewis's Grace Clairville, the heroine, Mabel, is murdered by the villain. Her body is found beneath a cliff over a month after her murder in almost perfect condition. She hasn't even started to decompose. Her murderer must, quote, look upon her beauteous face, the intact manifestation of her everlasting virtue. Characters like Susan and Mabel were written to suffer for you, the audience. The average working-class Victorian could walk away from the theater feeling as if they'd gained something. A lesson on morality, perhaps. A sense of social validation or fulfillment. Melodramas weren't made to be realistic. They were meant to provide shining examples of 19th century English virtues. It's easy to scoff at melodrama now. Just feels like some over-the-top, outdated medium of the past. But some of the sentiments in these plays are still very much alive today. The archetype of the fallen woman is, in a way, more prolific and more personal than it's ever been. You can really see this in what some people refer to as the waif aesthetic, a term I learned from chatting with Juno Moth. Thanks, Juno. She has a bunch of videos like this on her channel if you're into that, so definitely go check it out if you haven't already. As I understand it, the waif aesthetic is one of those new micro-art movements like cottagecore or dark academia. It's built specifically around an idealized image of victimhood. If Susan from Love's Frailties had a Tumblr, this is what she'd be posting. Pastel pinks, wounded fawns, sacrificial lambs tied down with ribbons and lace, often overlaid with text reading, "You will die in a world that hates you. I'm not worth saving. Preserve your eternal innocence. Suppress, repress, regress." You can't help but get a sense of irony from these posts, a sort of latent awareness of the performance. What they're doing is somewhere between memes, mood boards, and cries for help. There's this sense that they're trying to create or elevate some kind of ideal victim, a perfect victim. The pose stories, the melodramas, the aesthetic posts all seem to serve this vision, this idea that there's a kind of person whose suffering is worth more than everyone else's. The perfect victim is beautiful and tragic. Their pain always attracts sympathy. Tortured, but effortless. Emotional, but never angry. Every post I saw from the waif community left me wondering, can victimhood really be this desirable? Considering all of this, it's hard not to get the impression that a lot of people see victimhood as valuable. Poe spoke very directly about how much artistic inspiration he derived from a beautiful woman's suffering. Mabel's miraculously preserved corpse was depicted as a reflection of her purity, a trait the Victorians viewed as aspirational. For those in the waif subculture, it's almost like a coping mechanism for real-life trauma. If it's pretty, maybe it'll hurt less. And I get it, I think. If these things were your only lens on victimhood, it would look beautiful. This kind of art provides all this value to all these different people, all while maintaining the sense that victimhood is delicate, fantastical, easy to process. When it seems to benefit you and it doesn't hurt to look at, empathy for the victim is easy. That kind of victim is ideal, perfect. It's also pure fiction. It doesn't exist. Mima Kirigoe, a former pop idol turned actress, isn't the kind of victim we see in Victorian melodramas. She's not a one-dimensional symbol of innocence. She feels like a real person. The film Perfect Blue spends a lot of time showing us who Mima is, away from the cameras and the stage. We see her go to the grocery store. We watch her learn to use the internet. By the time she becomes a victim, she feels like someone we know, which makes what happens next far more difficult to watch. In order to prove her commitment to acting, Mima agrees to participate in an exploitative television scene. Abandoning her innocent pop star image, she's cast as a stripper who gets violently assaulted in a nightclub. Her original audience doesn't take this well. She's harassed, stalked, abused, pressured on all sides, torn between identities. Mima's psyche starts to break down. Her reality fractures. She imagines a doppelganger of herself, her old pop star persona, who follows her around, calling her filthy and tarnished. The further her mental state deteriorates, the harder it becomes to tell what's real and what isn't. Throughout Perfect Blue, we're encouraged to sympathize with Mima. How could you not? We're also pretty much the only ones who do. TV executives and photographers exploit her body, capitalizing on her scandalous transformation from pop idol to sex symbol. Fans rush to buy the product they're selling. Even her former band members gossip about her. No one in the movie seems to feel anything for her as a victim. And she is a victim. The threats Mima faces aren't purely psychological. Her stalker nearly kills her, convinced he needs to save the real Mima, her pop star image, from an imposter. It's a delusion encouraged by Mima's own manager, Rumi. Since she could never become an idol, Rumi spent years living vicariously through Mima's fame. She constructed her whole identity around her client. And so the second Mima's pop star image fell apart, Rumi's own mental state shattered. Mima isn't what you'd call a perfect victim. Her suffering isn't pretty. It's hard to watch. Much of Perfect Blue takes place inside her own head, giving us a painfully intimate view of her perspective. Remember what I said earlier about how all these different art forms position the victim as a source of value? How people often expect to get something from watching the victim's suffering? For Mima's stalker, her fans, the executives, the photographers, even her manager, her suffering is worth far less than what her more palatable, public-facing image can provide. Mima's victimhood isn't valuable enough, so none of them even try to empathize with her. As her manager, it's Rumi's job to support Mima. For all of the pain she sees Mima endure firsthand, she would rather preserve a fantasy than confront the suffering she's created. She wants Mima to be her idol, in more ways than one. The concept of suffering is central to Perfect Blue in a way that it isn't in the melodramas. You can't romanticize Mima in the way that Poe romanticizes Annabel Lee. If you did, you'd look like a creep. The film requires you to confront a very messy, very human sort of pain. Here, empathy is difficult and fraught and costly. It is not just beautiful. If you're a Junji Ito fan like me, you probably know who Tomie is. The mangas she stars in all follow a certain formula. Her admirers are driven to obsession and eventually to murder over her beauty. Over and over again, she is brutalized and disfigured, and every time she comes back as something else. On the surface, Tomie seems like another iteration of the perfect victim archetype. I mean, she's gorgeous, by human standards at least, and her only purpose in the story is to suffer at the hands of cruel people over and over. What makes Tomie different, though, and what you might already be expecting me to say, is that she is not a good person. On a good day, she's just downright mean, never without a cruel remark for any of the people she considers to be beneath her. On a bad day, she's literally evil. In one story, she even sexually grooms a child. Not even death can absolve her of these traits. Arguably, it just makes her worse. She's killed and she comes back as hundreds of cannibalistic, dead-eyed clones, as hideous, fleshy growths in the walls of a cave, as a shambling mess of bulbous heads and larval appendages. In both a figurative and a literal sense, Tomie is a monster. She's abusive with no real sense of empathy for anyone around her. She's a shape-shifting succubus thing, a walking husk filled with nothing but spite. So, is she still a victim? Considering everything she's done and who she is, does she deserve to be called one? At this point, that might feel like a hard argument to make, but I would say yes. Remember, Tomie is an object to everyone around her. Constantly lusted after, continuously murdered. Her behavior is awful and it is inexcusable, but it's also a product of the equally awful world that shapes her. When she is inevitably killed in every story, it's usually out of obsession and greed, not because she's a bad person. It's not justice. It's just pure evil. and she has to endure it over and over. Which sort of begs an interesting question. If she is still technically a victim, and we know that victimhood tends to be valuable to people, what could you possibly get out of her suffering? There's not really a moral lesson to be learned here. It certainly isn't pretty to look at. I suppose there is the catharsis of seeing her get revenge on her abusers. You can read Tomie as a sort of twisted vigilante anti-hero if you want, but that's not really the same as empathy, is it? One of the most interesting things about Tomie is that, although she is technically a victim, every aspect of her rejects it. She resists that status. If you're going to call her a victim, you also feel obligated to address the fact that she's a bad person. If you're going to call her a victim, you need to see through the fact that she technically already got her revenge. She does not lend herself to victimhood. And yet, it must be horrific to be in her shoes. You can empathize with her, of course. Many people do. But in order to do that, you have to read between the lines and interpret the story for yourself. It takes real work. It costs you something. Annabel Lee is actually an amazing poem, full of worthy and interesting material. But it isn't about Annabel Lee. It's about nebulous, hard-to-define concepts like lost love and ephemeral beauty. In fact, within the poem, Annabel Lee isn't really a character at all. She's a metaphor. Her image can express those concepts so well because she's just an image. Her death is beautiful, painless, as if she was killed by angels. When Poe talks about the death of a beautiful woman and the lips best suited to the topic, he is, of course, talking about himself, his own feelings about beauty and romance. I don't think real victimhood looks like what we see in the melodramas and the wave aesthetic. I think it looks more like Perfect Blue. It's painful and difficult to process. And Tomie? It's easy to forget that she's even a victim at all. It feels bad to feel bad for these two. And I think that's a good thing. Real victims aren't one-dimensional Susans and Mabels. Empathizing with someone doesn't just mean you feel emotions when you observe their suffering. It means you feel their pain. It's supposed to be an unpleasant experience. I understand the appeal of a perfect victim, someone whose suffering costs you nothing whatsoever to observe and fawn over and romanticize. But that doesn't exist. The perfect victim is not a person or a character. It's a complex within the audience, the artist. A desire for all the beauty and meaning and value of victimhood without ever having to see the pain. One thing we really didn't have time to touch on here is the authorial conceit of all these characters. I think there's an argument to make that while the melodramatic fallen woman archetype is a really interesting reflection of the values of their time, they're also kind of bad writing. It's the sort of uncharitable archetype most writers try to avoid putting into their work, and often fail because, writing is hard. How do you write a whole person well? It's not something you just come equipped for. There's a writing course I really love called the Creative Writing Bootcamp. It's taught by best-selling author and writing instructor Mila Goldberg. What I like so much about this course is that Goldberg puts a lot of emphasis on empathy. She shows you how to create something called an empathy Venn diagram and how to use that not only to flesh out your characters, but to really understand them as people. This is the kind of writing advice I look for. Not how to write a bestseller, but how to write with empathy. This is how I think the really great stories get written. And if you're a fan of Foundry, which, if you're watching this far into the ad spot, I assume you are, you can watch it for free. You've probably heard about Skillshare 100 times by now. I get it. It's one of those companies that kind of just turns into a sponsor buzzword. But I'm here to tell you that it's actually great. There's a reason you've heard the name so much. This is a platform that changes lives. I've run across artists in the wild who also just use Skillshare all the time. It puts the skills you've always wanted to learn within arm's reach by empowering other creatives to teach you what they know. It's less of an educational app and more of a community. And because there are so many creatives on Skillshare, it's got courses on pretty much everything. Coding, music, cooking, business, photography, graphic design. Seriously, if there's a skill you want to learn, chances are someone's made a Skillshare course on it. So, that creative writing course I was talking about, the Creative Writing Bootcamp, I want you to at least look at it, if you have the time. It'll cost you literally nothing if you go now, because the first 500 people who use our link will get access to the course and everything else Skillshare has to offer for free. 1 whole month of Skillshare and all it has to offer. If it's not for you, cancel and never pay a dime. But at least give it a shot. I really think you'll love this course. Again, click the link in the description to get started for free. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next week. Bye!